The fluorescent lights hummed above the empty classroom, but Wade Brennan couldn't hear them. All he could hear was the question the teacher had just asked her, pen frozen mid-air above the progress report. Who taught him sign language? Her voice was calm, professional waiting. Wade's mouth opened, then closed. His hands, calloused from years of carpentry, pressed hard against his knees. He went silent. But the teacher wasn't looking at him anymore. Her eyes had dropped to his son's chest, to the small wooden pendant carved with a star, and the color drained from her face. Colby tugged at his father's sleeve, then waved goodbye with both hands, rising to his chest and opening wide like wings taking flight. The teacher's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, dark liquid spreading across the desk like a secret spilling out. She knew that sign. She knew that pendant. And the man sitting across from her had no idea what he had just walked into. Wade Brennan had arrived at Riverside Elementary 15 minutes early, which was unusual for a man who spent most of his days covered in sawdust and racing against deadlines. He had showered twice, changed his shirt 3 times, and still managed to find a wood shaving stuck to his collar in the rearview mirror. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars scattered near the entrance, and a black sedan that looked far too expensive for this neighborhood. He guided Colby through the front doors, the boy's small hand warm in his own, and tried to remember the last time he had set foot in a school. 4 years ago, maybe. Back when his wife had still been around, back when she had handled these things, back when everything had been different. The hallway smelled of floor wax and construction paper, and Colby's sneakers squeaked against the linoleum as they walked. Wade watched his son's eyes dart from one classroom door to the next, taking in the colorful posters and student artwork that lined the walls. At 6 years old, Colby had already learned to navigate a world that didn't always know how to include him. He couldn't hear the announcements over the intercom or the laughter of other children during recess, but he noticed things most people missed. The way light fell through windows, the subtle shift in someone's expression before they spoke. He was observant in ways that sometimes startled Wade, as if silence had sharpened all his other senses into something almost supernatural. They found room 12 at the end of the east wing, and Wade knocked twice before pushing the door open. The classroom was empty, except for a woman sitting behind the teacher's desk, her auburn hair pulled back in a loose bun, reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked up when they entered, and Wade noticed something flicker across her face, something he couldn't quite name. She was younger than he had expected, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of composed posture that suggested she was used to being in control. Her name, according to the email he had received, was Marlene Ashford. She stood and extended her hand, and when Wade shook it, he was surprised by the firmness of her grip. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice measured and professional. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Wade guided Colby to one of the small chairs arranged in front of her desk and settled into the one beside him. The chair was designed for children, and his knees rose awkwardly, making him feel oversized and out of place. Marlene watched them with an expression that was hard to read, her eyes moving from Wade's face to Colby's, then lingering on the boy's chest, where a small wooden pendant hung from a leather cord. Wade had made that cord himself, replaced it twice when the original had worn thin. The pendant, though he had never made. It had come from somewhere else entirely, from a time and place he rarely allowed himself to think about. Marlene pulled a folder from her desk and opened it, her eyes scanning the pages inside. "Colby has been doing remarkably well in the inclusive program." She began, her tone shifting into something more formal. "His reading comprehension is above grade level, and his teachers have noted that he's particularly skilled at visual problem solving. He's made several friends in his class, and he seems to genuinely enjoy being here." Wade nodded, feeling a small swell of pride. He had worked hard to give Colby every opportunity, had stayed up late, researching schools and programs, had learned an entirely new language just to communicate with his own son. It hadn't been easy, especially not in the beginning, especially not after his wife had walked out. "There is one thing I wanted to ask you about," Marlene continued, and something in her voice changed. It became quieter, more careful, as if she were approaching something fragile. "Colby's sign language is exceptional. His vocabulary, his fluency, the nuance of his expressions. It's beyond what we typically see in children, his age, even those who've been signing since birth." She looked up from the folder, her eyes meeting Wade's, with an intensity that made him shift in his seat. "Who taught him sign language?" The question hung in the air between them, simple on the surface, but carrying a weight Wade could feel pressing against his chest. Wade's mouth opened, then closed. His hands, still rough from sanding a cabinet that morning, pressed hard against his knees. The answer was complicated, tangled up with memories he had buried deep with a promise he had made to a boy he had known for only a few months. A boy who had taught him more about patience and kindness than anyone else in his life. A boy who had been dead for 3 years. Wade went silent, and in that silence, the classroom seemed to shrink around him, the fluorescent lights buzzing louder, the walls pressing closer. He could feel Marlene's eyes on him, waiting, watching, and he didn't know how to explain something he had never spoken about to anyone. But Marlene wasn't looking at him anymore. Her gaze had dropped to Colby's chest, to the small wooden pendant carved with a star, and the color drained from her face. Her hands, which had been resting calmly on the desk, began to tremble. Wade watched her expression shift from professional curiosity to something raw and unguarded, something that looked almost like recognition. She stared at the pendant, as if it were a ghost, as if it had risen from a grave she had been tending for years. Colby, unaware of the tension building around him, tugged at his father's sleeve and signed that he wanted to go play. Then he turned to Marlene and waved goodbye, both hands rising to his chest and opening wide like wings taking flight. The coffee cup slipped from Marlene's fingers before she could catch it. Dark liquid spread across the desk, soaking into papers and dripping onto the floor, but she didn't move to clean it up. She was frozen, her eyes locked on Colby's hands on the sign he had just made. Wade recognized that sign. He had taught it to Colby himself, had learned it from a 7-year-old boy in a treatment center 4 years ago. It wasn't a standard sign, wasn't in any textbook or curriculum. It was something the boy had invented, a private gesture that meant something only to him. And somehow, impossibly, this woman knew it. She knew the pendant, she knew the sign. And the look on her face told Wade that whatever he had walked into was far bigger than a parent-teacher conference. The seconds stretched into something longer, heavier, as Marlene stared at the spreading pool of coffee without seeing it. Wade reached for a stack of napkins on the corner of her desk and began soaking up the liquid more to give his hands something to do than out of any real concern for the mess. Colby had wandered to the window, pressing his palms against the glass and watching a group of older kids play basketball on the court outside. He was oblivious to the storm gathering behind him, to the way his teacher's breathing had become shallow and uneven. Wade finished cleaning the desk and looked up to find Marlene's eyes still fixed on his son. But they had changed. They were wet now, glistening under the fluorescent lights, and her jaw was clenched tight enough to show the tension in her neck. Where did he learn that sign? Her voice was barely above a whisper, stripped of its earlier professionalism. Wade felt something cold settle in his stomach, a premonition of doors opening that had been closed for years. He could lie. He could tell her it was something Colby had picked up from a video or another child at the center. But the way she was looking at his son, the way her hands were shaking, told him that she already knew something already suspected, something that went beyond casual curiosity. He took a breath and let it out slowly, feeling the weight of the past pressing against his shoulders, like a physical thing. "I taught him," Wade said, finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "I learned it from a boy I met at the Sunridge Treatment Center 4 years ago. I was volunteering there trying to learn sign language so I could talk to Colby. My wife had just left, and I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know anything about raising a deaf child, about communicating with him about any of it. He stopped swallowing hard against the memories that threatened to surface. There was a boy there, 7 years old, brown hair, always drawing pictures of birds and airplanes. He was alone most of the time, and he started teaching me signs, the standard ones at first, but then his own inventions. Private signs he had made up. He said they were more real than the official ones because they came from his heart instead of a book. Marlene's hand moved to her mouth, pressing against her lips, as if to hold back something that wanted to escape. Her eyes had never left Colby, but Wade could see that she wasn't really seeing his son anymore. She was seeing someone else, someone who existed only in memory, someone who had left a hole in her life that nothing could fill. Wade recognized that look. He had worn it himself for months after his wife left, after he realized he would be raising Colby alone, after he understood that some absences never truly heal. But there was something deeper in Marlene's expression, something more devastating than abandonment. It was the look of a mother who had lost a child. "His name," she said, and her voice cracked on the word. "The boy who taught you. What was his name?" Wade hesitated, feeling the ground shift beneath him. He had never known the boy's last name, had never asked about his family or his history. They had simply existed together in that treatment center for 3 months, two people bound by circumstance and a shared need for connection. The boy had called him Mr. Wade, had laughed at his clumsy attempts at signing, had patiently corrected his mistakes, over and over, until the movements became natural. And then one day, the boy wasn't there anymore. The nurses had told Wade only that he had been transferred to another facility, and Wade had accepted that explanation because the alternative was too painful to consider. "Oliver," Wade said softly. He said his name was Oliver. The sound that escaped Marlene's throat was something between a gasp and a sob, a noise so raw and broken that Wade instinctively reached across the desk toward her. She pulled back her chair, scraping against the floor, as she stood, her hand still pressed to her mouth. She was trembling now, her whole body shaking with the effort of holding herself together. Colby turned from the window, sensing the disturbance, even though he couldn't hear it, and looked at his father with concern. Wade signed for him to wait, that everything was okay, but he wasn't sure if that was true. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. Marlene walked to the window, her back to Wade, her shoulders rising and falling with unsteady breaths. Outside, the basketball game continued, the sound of bouncing balls and shouting kids muffled by the glass. She stood there for what felt like a long time, and Wade didn't interrupt. He had learned in his years of working with wood that some things couldn't be rushed. You had to let the grain reveal itself, had to wait for the right moment to make your cut. People were the same way. They needed space to process, to gather themselves, to decide what they were willing to share. "Oliver was my son," Marlene said finally, and the words fell like stones into still water. "He died 3 years ago, a congenital heart defect. We knew it was coming, but knowing doesn't prepare you for anything. It just gives you more time to dread." She turned to face Wade, and he saw that her composure had returned, at least on the surface. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady, controlled. "I was the CEO of Ashford Educational Systems, 3,700 employees, 200 million in revenue, schools, and programs across the country. I was building an empire, and I told myself it was for him. I told myself that everything I was doing was to give him a better future." She laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitterness. "His future lasted 8 years, and I spent most of those years in boardrooms instead of hospital rooms." Wade felt the pieces clicking into place, forming a picture he hadn't expected and wasn't sure he wanted to see. The treatment center where he had met Oliver had been expensive, exclusive, the kind of place that catered to families with resources. He had always assumed the boy's parents were somewhere nearby, visiting during hours when Wade wasn't there. It had never occurred to him that a child could be so alone in a place designed to care for him, that a mother could be absent not from cruelty, but from the kind of ambition that blinds people to what truly matters. I was at Sunridge. Marlene continued, her eyes moving to Colby, who had returned to watching the basketball game. When he wasn't there, when he needed me most. The center called it a residential program, said it would be better for his development to have consistent professional care. I believed them because I wanted to believe them. I needed an excuse to keep working, to keep building, to keep running from the fact that my son was dying, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Her voice hardened, and Wade saw anger beneath the grief directed inward like a blade. He spent his last months with strangers, with nurses and therapists and volunteers, while I negotiated mergers and reviewed quarterly projections. The weight of her confession settled over the room like a shroud. Wade thought about the boy he had known, about his quiet laugh and his patient hands, about the drawings he had made of birds with impossibly long wings. He had never seemed sad, never complained about being alone, never asked where his mother was. He had simply accepted his circumstances with a grace that Wade hadn't understood until now. Oliver had known, even at 7 years old, that his mother wasn't coming. He had made peace with it in a way that most adults never could. And in those final months, he had found a connection with a stranger, a carpenter with rough hands and a broken heart, who needed to learn his language. "The pendant," Wade said, and his voice came out hoarse. "Oliver made it for me. He said it was for my little brother, but I didn't have a brother. When I tried to explain, he just smiled and said I would understand someday." He looked down at Colby, at the small wooden star resting against his chest, and felt the full weight of what had passed between them. Colby was 2 years old when I started volunteering at Sunridge. Oliver never met him, but he knew about him. I used to show him pictures, tell him stories about the things Colby did. Oliver wanted to make something for him, something to protect him. He spent weeks carving that pendant with a pocket knife the nurses didn't know he had. Marlene crossed the room slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she were approaching something sacred. She knelt in front of Colby, her eyes level with his, and the boy turned from the window to face her. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the woman who had lost everything, and the child who carried a piece of what she had lost. Then Marlene raised her hands and made the sign Oliver had invented, the one that meant, "Fly away," the one Colby had learned from his father without knowing its origin. Her hands rose to her chest, then opened wide like wings taking flight. Colby's face broke into a smile, the bright and unguarded smile of a child who has found someone who speaks his language. He made the sign back to her, his small hands moving with the confidence of long practice, and something in Marlene's expression shifted. The grief was still there, would probably always be there, but it had made room for something else. Recognition. Connection. The ghost of her son alive in the hands of a stranger's child, speaking words she had thought she would never hear again. Wade watched them, father and teacher and son, bound together by a boy who had been dead for 3 years, but whose presence still lingered in the space between them. He thought about all the things he hadn't known, all the questions he hadn't asked, all the assumptions he had made about Oliver's life and family. He thought about the guilt he had carried since learning of the boy's death, the sense that he should have done more, should have found out what happened to him, should have honored his memory in some tangible way. And he realized, watching Marlene sign to his son, that he had been doing exactly that without knowing it. Every sign he had taught Colby, every gesture Oliver had invented, was a thread connecting the living to the dead, keeping a small boy's legacy alive in the hands of those who had loved him. The afternoon light had shifted, casting long shadows across the classroom floor, and Wade became aware of how much time had passed. The parent-teacher conference had become something else entirely, a collision of histories he hadn't known were connected, a revelation that changed everything and nothing at the same time. Colby still the boy he had raised alone for 4 years, still the center of his universe. But now Wade knew where some of that universe had come from, knew the name of the woman who had given birth to his son's teacher, knew the weight she carried every day she walked into this building. Marlene stood slowly brushing off her skirt, with hands that had stopped trembling. She looked at Wade, with eyes that held 1,000 questions, but she asked only one. "Will you tell me about him? About the time you spent with Oliver? I have photographs, and medical records, and progress reports. But I don't have stories. I don't know what made him laugh, or what he dreamed about, or who he was when I wasn't there." Her voice caught on the last words, and Wade saw the cost of asking the admission that she had been absent when it mattered most. He nodded, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been tight for years. "Yeah," he said, "I can do that. I can tell you everything." And for the first time since he had walked into this classroom, Wade felt like he understood why he was here, not just for a progress report or a conference about his son's education, but for something larger, something that had been set in motion 4 years ago by a 7-year-old boy with a pocket knife and a vision of wings. They talked until the sun went down, until the janitor came to lock the building and found them still sitting in the darkening classroom. Wade told her about Oliver's drawings, about the way he had arranged them on his wall in order of wingspan from hummingbirds to albatrosses. He told her about the games they had played, the stories they had invented, the silent conversations that had flowed between them like water. He told her about the last day he had seen Oliver, about the sign the boy had taught him, and the words he had spoken. "When you're sad," Oliver had said, his small hands moving with deliberate care, "do this, and I'll be there. I'll always be there." Marlene listened without interrupting, her eyes fixed on Wade's face, as if she could see her son reflected there. Occasionally, she would ask a question, a small detail. She clarified a moment, she wanted to understand better. And when Wade finished, when there was nothing left to tell, she sat in silence for a long time, processing everything she had heard. Colby had fallen asleep in his chair, his head resting against his father's arm, the wooden pendant rising and falling with each breath. The classroom was dark now, except for the emergency exit sign glowing red above the door, and the world outside had grown quiet. "I gave up everything after he died," Marlene said. Finally, her voice soft in the darkness. "Sold the company, donated most of the money, walked away from a life I had spent 20 years building. I thought I was punishing myself, making amends for all the time I had wasted. I came here to teach, because this was the school closest to Sunridge, because I thought, if I could help children like Oliver, maybe it would mean something. Maybe it would balance the scales." She shook her head slowly. "But scales don't balance. That's not how grief works. You just learn to carry the weight differently." Wade understood what she meant. He had learned his own version of that lesson when his wife had left, when he had realized that some things couldn't be fixed or replaced, only accepted and moved through. He looked at Colby, at the boy who had taught him more about love and patience than he had ever known existed, and felt a surge of gratitude so strong it almost brought tears to his eyes. He had been given a second chance, an opportunity to be the father he hadn't known how to be in the beginning. Not everyone got that chance. Not everyone had enough time. "Oliver wanted me to find you," Wade said, and the words surprised him even as they left his mouth. "I didn't know it then, but I know it now. The pendant, the signs, the stories I told him about Colby. He was building a bridge connecting us before we ever met. I don't know how he knew, or if he knew at all. But here we are. 3 years later in a classroom that could have been anywhere, and you're teaching my son the same way yours taught me." Marlene was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "He always believed in things I couldn't see. Angels and spirits and souls that lived on after bodies failed. I told him it was fantasy, that science didn't support any of it. But he just smiled and said that science hadn't discovered everything yet. She looked at Colby, at the pendant on his chest, at the small hands that knew her son's secret language. Maybe he was right. Maybe the things we can't explain are just the things we haven't learned to understand. The days that followed were different. Wade returned to his workshop, to the cabinets and shelves and custom furniture that paid his bills. But something had shifted inside him. He found himself thinking about Oliver more often, about the short time they had shared and the long shadow it had cast. He pulled out the drawings the boy had given him, the ones he had kept folded in a shoebox at the back of his closet, and hung them on his workshop wall. Birds of every kind, their wings spread wide, their eyes looking towards something beyond the frame. He wondered if Oliver had known even then that he was drawing his own escape. Marlene began staying after school to work with Colby, teaching him advanced signs and helping him with his reading. She never mentioned her past, or her fortune never treated him differently than any other student. But Wade saw the way she watched his son, the tenderness in her eyes, when Colby mastered a difficult concept, the grief that flickered across her face when he made the fly away sign at the end of each session. She was healing slowly in the way that broken things heal, not by becoming what they were before, but by becoming something new. One evening, as Wade picked up Colby from school, Marlene asked him to stay for a moment. She led him to a small office adjacent to her classroom and pulled a leather-bound journal from her desk drawer. "This was Oliver's," she said, holding it out to him. "His diary from those last months at Sunridge. I couldn't read it for 3 years. I couldn't bear to see his handwriting, to hear his voice in my head. But I read it last night, all of it, and I need you to see something." She opened the journal to a page near the end and handed it to Wade. The handwriting was uneven, the letters slanting in different directions, like trees bent by wind. But the words were clear enough, and Wade felt his throat tighten as he read them. "Mr. Wade came again today. He showed me a picture of his son. His son can't hear either, just like me. Mr. Wade is learning to talk with his hands so they can understand each other. I think that's the best kind of love, when someone learns a whole new way to speak just so they can tell you they care. I'm making something for his son, a pendant with a star, because stars are like us. We're small and quiet, but we shine. Mom says I should rest more, but I want to finish it first. I want Colby to have it. I want him to know that someone was thinking about him even though they never met." Wade's vision blurred, and he realized he was crying. He hadn't cried since the day his wife left, hadn't allowed himself that release. But now the tears came freely, and he didn't try to stop them. He thought about a 7-year-old boy carving a pendant with hands that would never grow old, thinking about a 2-year-old he had never met, hoping to create a connection that would outlast his own brief life. The selflessness of it, the pure and uncomplicated love, was almost too much to bear. Marlene was crying, too silent, tears tracking down her cheeks. "He wrote about you almost every day," she said. "You and Colby. You were his favorite subject, even more than birds. He said you reminded him of the men in old stories, the ones who built things with their hands and didn't need many words because their actions spoke for them." She took a shaky breath. "I was so busy building an empire that I missed my own son building a legacy. He did more in his short life than I did in all my years of meetings and mergers. He connected people. He created love where there was none. And he did it with a pocket knife and a journal and a heart bigger than anyone knew." They stood together in the small office, two strangers who had become something more, bound by a child who had seen what they couldn't see and reached across time to bring them together. Wade thought about all the ways life could have gone differently, all the choices that had led him to that treatment center, to that boy, to this moment. He thought about his wife, about her inability to accept their son's deafness, about the way she had walked out without looking back. And he thought about Marlene, about her empire, and her regret about the years she had lost, and the years she had left. "What are you going to do now?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "With everything. With the school, with your life." Marlene wiped her eyes and looked out the window where the last light of day was fading into purple dusk. "I'm going to build something," she said. "Not an empire this time. Something smaller, something real. A school for children like Oliver and Colby, where they can learn and grow and create in their own language. A place where no child has to feel alone, where every parent can be present, even when they can't be there. I've been thinking about it for months, but I didn't have the courage to start." She turned to face him, and there was something new in her eyes, something that looked like hope. "I want to call it Oliver's Wings, and I want you to help me build it." Wade thought about his workshop, about the cabinets and shelves and custom orders that had defined his life for years. He thought about Colby, about the world his son would grow up in, about the opportunities that existed and the ones that didn't. He thought about Oliver, about a 7-year-old boy who had carved a star and dreamed of flying, who had known somehow that his short life would matter beyond its ending. And he nodded. Slowly, feeling something settle into place inside him, a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was missing. "Yeah," he said, "I can do that. I can help you build it." Marlene smiled, the first real smile Wade had seen from her, and for a moment, she looked younger, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Oliver would have liked that," she said. "He always wanted to bring people together. He said it was the most important thing anyone could do." Wade thought about the pendant around his son's neck, about the sign that meant, "Fly away," about all the invisible threads connecting the living to the dead. And he realized that Oliver had done exactly what he set out to do. He had brought people together. He had built something that lasted. The months that followed were filled with plans and permits, and endless meetings with contractors and designers. Wade found himself spending more time at Marlene's side than in his workshop, sketching floor plans and reviewing budgets and interviewing potential staff. Colby came with him, often playing in the empty spaces that would soon become classrooms and therapy rooms. His small hands leaving prints on windows that overlooked the future. The building they had chosen was an old factory on the outskirts of town, a brick structure with high ceilings and large windows that let in floods of natural light. It had been abandoned for years, left to decay, while the neighborhood around it struggled and changed. Now it would become something new, something alive, something that carried a dead boy's name into the world. The grand opening was held on a Saturday in late spring, when the trees were heavy with blossoms and the air smelled of cut grass and possibility. Wade stood at the entrance, watching families stream through the doors, children of all ages and abilities, exploring the spaces he had helped create. There were classrooms designed for visual learners, therapy rooms with equipment for every need, a library filled with books in Braille and large print and sign language. There was an art studio with easels and canvases and walls covered in drawings of birds, tributes to a boy who had loved to dream of flight. And above the main entrance, carved into a wooden sign that Wade had made himself, were the words, "Oliver's Wings," with a small star beside them. Marlene stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her eyes bright with tears she no longer tried to hide. 3 years of grief had not disappeared, would never fully disappear, but it had transformed into something else. Purpose, legacy, the knowledge that her son's short life had mattered, that his dreams had taken root in the world and grown into something beautiful. She had given away most of her fortune to create this place, had poured everything she had into honoring his memory. And standing here now, watching children laugh and play and learn in the spaces her son had inspired, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Colby ran up to them, his face flushed with excitement, his hands moving rapidly, as he described everything he had seen. Wade knelt to his son's level and signed back, asking questions, sharing in his joy. The boy's vocabulary had expanded enormously under Marlene's guidance, and he could now express thoughts and feelings that had once been trapped inside him. He talked about the art studio, about the birds on the walls, about the other children who knew his language without being taught. And then, as naturally as breathing, he made the sign that Oliver had invented. His hands rose to his chest and opened wide like wings taking flight, and his smile was bright enough to light the entire building. Marlene watched them, father and son, connected by a language that a dead boy had helped teach. She thought about Oliver, about his quiet laugh and his patient hands, about the dreams he had drawn on paper and carved into wood. She thought about the years she had lost to ambition, the moments she had traded for meetings and mergers, the son she had loved but hadn't known how to reach. And she thought about the strange path that had led her here to this building and this man and this child, to a legacy she had never imagined, and a family she had found in the ruins of her grief. Wade stood and turned to face her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The noise of the celebration faded around them, replaced by a silence that felt sacred, like the hush of a church or the stillness of a forest at dawn. Then Wade raised his hands and made the sign, the one Oliver had taught him, the one that meant fly away, but also meant something more. It meant, I'm still here. It meant, you're not alone. It meant, love doesn't end when life does. Marlene made the sign back, her eyes locked on his, and something passed between them that didn't need words or gestures to be understood. It was gratitude, and grief, and hope, and healing, all tangled together into something new. It was the knowledge that they had both been broken, and had both found ways to become whole again. It was the gift that Oliver had given them, the bridge he had built across time and death and silence, connecting two strangers who needed each other more than they had known. Colby grabbed their hands and pulled them toward the art studio, eager to show them something he had made. They followed him through the crowded halls, past children and parents and teachers, past the library and the therapy rooms and the classrooms filled with light. And as they walked, Wade thought about the question that had started everything, the question Marlene had asked in that empty classroom on an ordinary afternoon. Who taught him sign language? The answer was simple and complicated, tragic and beautiful a story that wound through years and lives and deaths to arrive at this moment. A boy named Oliver had taught him, a boy who couldn't hear but could see more clearly than anyone, a boy who had known somehow that his life would be short and had decided to make it matter anyway. He had carved a star and invented a sign and built a bridge that stretched across the years, and now in a building that bore his name, surrounded by children who would never know him but would carry his legacy forward. He was still teaching, still connecting, still flying. And Wade, holding his son's hand and walking beside a woman who had lost everything and found something new, understood at last what Oliver had been trying to tell him all along. Love doesn't end. It just changes shape. It becomes a pendant and a sign, and a school full of children becomes a father learning to speak with his hands, becomes a mother learning to forgive herself. It becomes the invisible threads that connect us, the ones we can't see, but can always feel, the ones that remind us we are never truly alone. The sign for "fly away" rose in the air one more time, made by 3 pairs of hands that had learned it from the same source. And somewhere in a place beyond words or silence, a boy with brown hair and a pocket knife smiled and spread his wings.